All right, thank you everybody for showing up to the first ever Spokes Beyond Seat Time data analysis workshop. We're going to talk about SoloStorm today, give a little bit of an overview of SoloStorm, how it's used, what equipment you need to use it, and then we're going to go right into analyzing some real data, some real runs from the Spokes Autocross from May 19th, which was yesterday. And we've got Vivek here from Beyond Seat Time to help us analyze some of the data, give us some best practices and tips on how to do that with real live data. Vivek, did you want to do any intro or before we start? You want me to just get started?
Sure, I'll just do like a little brief thing about what Beyond Seat Time is and stuff. So for those that don't know, I run a kind of driving and autocross website called Beyond Seat Time, which is www.beyondseattime.com. There are tons of articles on driving techniques, underlying principles of going faster, psychology of performance, etc. Feel free to go check it out. There's new stuff added every month or two in general. In addition, there's also a full online course for learning to be a better autocrosser called the Complete Autocrosser's Manual. It's really for drivers of all skill levels who want to understand the nuances of autocross, learn to read autocross courses better, figure out how to keep the car more closely at the limit, how to improve your execution, the kind of mental and psychological sides of performing better, etc. About hundreds of autocrossers from around the country, including several Spokes drivers, have enrolled in the course already. Rick, Jerry, Troy, Evan, I'm going off memory here, Matt Morehard, Anthony Oliveri, Aaron Prince, Mark Noble, blah, 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 a whole bunch of them. Talk to any of them about it and get their thoughts on whether the course has been helpful to them or not. And if you're interested, feel free to sign up. That's about it.
Awesome, thank you. And one of the reasons I wanted to get this discussion started or this meeting on the books was after seeing some of the content that Vivek had on data analysis in the actual paid version of the course, and I thought it was really good and probably a good topic for us all to check out. All right, so first off, let me share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. We're going to go pretty quickly again through the overview because I think most people are experienced with it, but I want to make sure anybody new on the call, anybody new to autocross or SoloStorm can get some basics. So this is the SoloStorm main website. Petrol Data is the manufacturer or the developer of the software. I would say that it is the premier kind of software for autocross data analysis. It also is used for track days, although I haven't used it in that way yet. So we're going to take a look at it. It is Android only, so you need an Android smartphone or an Android tablet to run it in your car to collect data. If you want to take advantage of some of the newest features like video integration, multiple cameras, and things like that, and to make sure that you have the best experience, you want a relatively newish Android device to run it. I'm going to go a little bit into the requirements, and anybody else on the call, feel free to jump in if you use something a little bit different and if it works for you. Personally, for me, I didn't want to mess around too much with hardware that may or may not work with it. So what I did was I grabbed the GPS receiver and the OBD2 reader that they recommend off of the website. So you probably recognize this. You've probably seen it on every other autocross car at our events. It's Q-Star's Bluetooth receiver. The most important thing about the Bluetooth GPS receiver is that it has a 10 hertz sample rate. This one is $85 on their website. You can also get them on Amazon and other online vendors. This is the one I use. Like I said, it's the most common. I was going for maximum compatibility with the software. Other people may use others. For the OBD2, very similar. You probably are looking at this and like, wow, this is a very expensive OBD2 tool. Again, I didn't want to have issues with, I've had a lot of cheap OBD2 Bluetooth devices, and while they work sometimes, I wanted to make sure that the data that I was gathering at every autocross was reliable, and I wasn't messing around with hardware that may have been incompatible or just didn't work as well as it could. So this is the one I got. I did not get it from this website. I went and bought it from somewhere else that was the same.
I will just jump in here and say that for the OBD2 reader, I've had really good success with the $20, $25 OBD2 readers too. They've been reliable. I've been using the same one for 3 years now, and it hasn't missed a beat. So, you know, if you want some of the, I don't know if these ones have additional features and stuff that may be important, but at least some of the cheap ones seem to do the job well enough.
Great, thanks. All right, any other questions about kind of the basics of SoloStorm? Essentially, you give them $200, which kind of sounds like a lot for an Android app, and they send you an APK that you install on your device, and then they send you in a separate email a license key so that you can unlock that that software. And you'll need to check on your own, but my understanding based on the license agreement is that you can put that software on as many devices as you want for your own use, which comes in handy for some of the other stuff we're gonna talk about today. One pro tip on that: if you are going to an autocross on Saturday and you figure out that you want to buy SoloStorm on Friday evening to put into work at that next autocross the next day, probably not going to happen because they actually have to have a human send you the launch code. So don't ask me how I know. Missed at least one event that way. All right, so another thing that I thought was kind of cool is I've actually, since tablets are kind of small, they're a very physical device that can only be in one place at one time. What I found that's been very useful is using an emulator to emulate an Android device to do post-event data analysis. This is cool because for many reasons, but I think the portability is the best reason, right? If you're on a PC at work, don't tell your boss. You're on PC at work, or you've got a PC at home, or you're somewhere else. You don't have the same tablet that you use to capture your runs. You can still do some analysis, and on a bigger screen too. I really like it because you can set the screen size almost as big as you want, and you don't have to worry about trying to do it on a phone, especially if that's what you're using for data collection. So this is just your typical Android Studio. You can Google Android Studio download. You'll get to this link. Make sure you're on android.com, obviously. You go down to download options. There's a few. I would recommend, if you want to do this, to download the full Android Studio IDE suite. You're probably only going to use the emulator, but that ensures that you have all the pieces you need to run it. While you're doing that, what I would also recommend before you fire up the emulator is to copy the SoloStorm APK or the application file that they sent you onto Google Drive or somewhere that's going to be easily accessible by a new Android device. So that's important because I'll bring up the Android Studio. This is Android Studio. When I launched it the first time, it asked me whether I wanted to create a project. I said yes. I accepted all the defaults, just created a blank project. You're not probably going to write any code or anything like that, but it just gets you up and running the quickest way to get to the emulator. Then you're going to run over here to Tools and AVD Manager. AVD Manager is really cool, and I apologize, it's really small. Android Studio does not scale if you want to try to scale it up. Good for developing, not so great for presenting on Zoom, but bear with me. AVD, Virtual Device Manager, is where you can create devices that you want to emulate. So as you can see here, the device I picked, and there's several kind of off-the-shelf devices that Android Studio provides. I chose the Pixel C because it had the highest resolution and the largest screen that was available off the shelf or already integrated into the tool. And go ahead and press go. As you can see, what that does is it brings up an emulated device. This works just like any other Android device. I wouldn't probably do your banking on here, but you can use it for this fairly low risk. So I'm going to go to SoloStorm. It's going to fire up just like it does on your tablet. It's pretty quick. Then I'm going to go through a couple of the configurations. Definitely once you get into the car, you want to configure your accelerometer here. That's going to be a long press. It's going to take you through a couple of steps where you drive in a straight line and then stop, and then it's going to calibrate that. That's going to be very important because some of the techniques that Vivek is going to show you require a fairly accurate accelerometer in G-force trace to analyze your runs, which I think is pretty cool. If you go to settings, if you have a OBD2 sensor, make sure that's connected via Bluetooth, not in the emulator, obviously, but in your car. One of the most important things when you connect an OBD2 reader is you want to make sure that you calibrate the throttle. I'm not sure if you have to do this every event, but I try to do it every event just to make sure it's accurate, right? You click on this little wrench and it'll give you, you'll be able to go from 0 to full throttle in your car, make sure it's in the on position but not started, and then that'll map out your throttle, calibrate your throttle so that it shows up correctly in the feed. The other thing that you want to do before an event is markers. So if you've seen people, walking around with their tablets and their GPS module during their course walks, this is what they're doing. You can set your stage, you can set your start and your finish. Stage is not super important, I don't think. Start and finish are useful to give you an estimated time for each run. It's not going to be super close to your actual time that was recorded with the start and finish timers and it's in the results, but it gives you an idea of the elapsed time for that run, and it makes it a little easier to compare your runs after the event, maybe after you've slept. Okay, get out of that. The other thing you're going to do is when you get that license key emailed to you, you are going to go and input that down here. Pretty simple, just like almost any Android app that's not installed from the Play Store. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to go to drivers. Oops. Thought that was a long press to go to drivers. So you'll be able to set up drivers in the other screen. You can add and remove drivers, check, uncheck drivers if you have a lot of people driving your car. When you start your first run during an event, you're going to obviously start on whoever's starting the first run. SoloStorm will automatically keep track of the drivers. So as soon as you get off course and stop and get back to grid, it'll automatically switch to the next driver. So that's pretty convenient. Now, if you have kind of a long stretch from the finish back to grid, and you're going over 5 miles an hour, which is configurable, you might get some false trips and have some extra data in there. So make sure to be aware of that. I usually try to check the tablet before each run, make sure it's on the right person.
Just a quick note on that, what Rick just mentioned. So that is a setting where there are a couple of things that can trigger the start of SoloStorm logging stuff, right? One is when you cross the stage and start beams, and it'll start recording a run. The other is you can also set it to where anytime you cross a certain mile per hour threshold, like I think by default it's set at 15 or 10 miles an hour, something like that, that it'll just assume you're starting an autocross run and will start recording. And that's what can create some extra logs where, when you're coming back after the finish, if you're going faster than 10 or 15 miles an hour, it may think you're starting another run and, just do that. So personally, I turn that off. I don't have it do any automatic triggers for me. I make sure to rely only on the markers, but do whatever.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so we're going to go into I think one of the best things about SoloStorm one of the best modifications that they made in recent months, I think maybe the last year or so, was adding cloud capability to it. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have this meeting too, because it's really cool to be able to see other people's runs at the same event you were at. So you can see I have some of Matt's runs, my runs, Vivek's, Evan's runs. You can tell which ones I've uploaded to the cloud and which ones I've downloaded, which is pretty interesting or pretty useful. In order to get to other runs, you can actually go to this cloud here. And then somewhat unintuitively, it shows you all of your things all of your logs that are on the cloud first. And then, but the best thing about this is that you can actually see other people's runs, right? So if you go on this three dots here, click on shared with me. This actually shows you all of the runs that have been uploaded that are associated with that date and relative GPS position, I think. So I can see Matt's run now, I can see Tom's run, and Michael's run as well, and as well as Eric's and Steve's. So that's how you get to them. In order to kind of download them, all you do is select one. Another thing that's not super intuitive, but you get used to it after a while, is that there's no OK button or anything like that in this app. Really, the trigger to do anything is just to hit this back button right here. So I'm going to click on Matt's run. I'm going to go back. It says, do you want to download it? Do you want videos? Sure. Well, I'm going to say load just for now. And then that'll download the run, and it'll be right here in my list, so I can use it to compare to my runs, obviously. So I think that's kind of the SoloStorm basics, the SoloStorm 101. That's what I wanted to go over first. Are there any questions on that, or any other kind of best practices or little tweaks that I missed that we want to talk about before we go into the data analysis portion of the talk?
Nothing from me unless someone else has something interesting to share.
I assume Vivek's going to show us how to load these in.
Matt, what do you mean load them in?
To look at them, right? Like, yeah. I don't know. Okay,
yeah. So that's kind of what I was showing before. So if you hit on the cloud and you go to shared with me, anytime you click on any of these and select these, and then hit the back button. I'm going to turn this off so it goes faster, and hit click download. It'll automatically download them to your local device. So now they're on my local device here. Here's Tom. Then I can use those if we wanted to compare Tom and Matt, and then just like you were on your tablet there. Again, that's the basics. I think we're going to transition over to Vivek now, and we're going to go start analyzing some of these runs. Do you want to share, or do you want me to share?
Let's try with sharing my screen.
Okay.
If that works, then great. Otherwise, we'll switch back to yours.
All righty.
All right. Give me a second to get my screen share started. Rick, it needs you to stop sharing so I can start sharing.
All righty.
All right. All right, I'm assuming you guys can all see my screen. I have a run loaded, right? Actually, let me even back up one more step. Like all I did was from the list of logs that that Rick was just showing, I selected Evan's run just to get started with that one. And then when I go back, it's just loaded a single run here, right? But before we get into analyzing some of this stuff, let's just talk a little more generally about data analysis for a second. So the way I like to think about it is, in general, we're looking for a result, right, or an effect, and then we try to find what the cause of that effect was. When we're comparing two runs, you know, kind of when Rick loaded two of them, the effect that we're generally looking for is time lost or time gained, right? And then we can figure out why that happened. Why was the time lost, or why was the time gained? What did one driver do better or worse than the other? When looking at a single run, we don't have something to compare against, right? We don't have a concept of where time may have been gained or lost. So the result that we look for, really the only thing we can look for to analyze how well we did or how poorly we did, is to think about, well, what does it take to go fast, right? There's literally only two things we have to do well. We have to use all of the grip that we have available to us, and we need to use the throttle as much as possible, right? So the thing that we're looking for when trying to analyze a single run is to see where we might have underutilized the grip that we had and where we may not have been accelerating as hard as we could. So we'll start with looking at a couple of examples of just analyzing single runs before we get to comparing a couple of runs side by side. So given that we want to see or compare rather how much grip we're using and such. SoloStorm provides a whole host of different channels that you can kind of pull up. So there's stuff like your speed, engine RPM, throttle position, brake pressure, blah, 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 blah. The list is like 20 or 30 long. All of that at once is completely overwhelming, and most of it is not as important. I think the most important things when analyzing a single run are to look at the lateral Gs, the longitudinal Gs. SoloStorm also shows what it calls combined Gs, where kind of does a combined vector of both your longitudinal and lateral Gs, which I think is useful. The speed trace is very useful, and throttle position can be useful as well. The reason I don't have throttle position on for looking at Evan's run is, for some reason, when I pull up his logs, his throttle position is 0 the entire time. So it's just, I don't have that data in his trace, but that's fine. We can get most of the information we need without it. I've selected 4 channels: speed, the combined Gs, longitudinal Gs, and lateral Gs. Actually, by the way, are you guys able to see my mouse as well as I move it around?
Yep, I can see.
Okay, cool. So those are the 4 traces we have. SoloStorm also kind of draws it draws a fairly rudimentary map of the path that you took. It's really important to understand that the map that it draws is not super accurate, right? Like you can't use it to really determine who drove a tighter line or a slightly wider line. It's just not accurate enough for that. The map is really only useful for knowing what part of the course you're currently looking at and where you are on the course. Like that's as much as stock as you should put in the map. All right, so with that, let's get started. Let's try to figure out, Evan, sorry to pick on you, let's try to figure out where you may have lost some time and what you did well too. So the way to advance stuff in SoloStorm is you can just click the play button and it'll play through the run as normal, but that's not as useful. The more interesting thing to do is to manually drag the timeline and move it to specific parts that you want, right? And this vertical orange line here is the point in time that we currently are. So we're seeing that at this point in time, Evan's speed is 33.3 miles an hour. He's accelerating with 0.5 Gs and has lateral load of almost 0.6 Gs simultaneously, right? So just so you understand what we're looking at, that's the point in time that we're at. So far, there's nothing particularly interesting. I mean, this start, he's accelerating pretty hard. We'll just keep moving the timeline forward. So you see his longitudinal Gs stay flat. This is just him being full throttle, likely in second gear at this point. I'm guessing this little dip down here was his shift from first to second gear. And then he's accelerating. Now here's where it starts getting interesting, right? So this is the point on the course where it was that kind of decreasing radius kind of transition maneuver. And so you see Evan start to get on the brakes. I don't know if it's visible, but there's a thin light gray horizontal line there. That's the 0G line. Anything above that on the longitudinal trace is acceleration. Anything below that is slowing down, either off throttle or braking. So what's interesting about this to me is you see Evan get on the brakes. So we head to the negative side of the longitudinal G trace. So we have this drop here, but then his brake pressure reduces before increasing again. So to me, there's some potential lost time there where that wasn't as efficient braking as he could have had. He maybe could have carried a little bit more speed into the corner and had a more smooth kind of dive into the brakes, as opposed to braking, needing to back off and then braking some more. So that's a little bit of lost time there. Oh, actually, I skipped ahead a little bit. Another thing I like doing before analyzing the nuances of each moment is I tend to scroll through the entire timeline to find where the peak of lateral G is, right? So we see that Evan reached about 1.3 Gs. So that's roughly what the car should be capable of. And we want to see where we might have underutilized less than that and see if there was a reason for that. So we know 1.3 is generally where we want to see his lateral load. All right, so we're back at this point where the braking wasn't quite as efficient as we would have liked. So again, a little bit of time lost there. We'll move forward just a tiny bit from there to where, you know, he's slowed into that left-hander when he starts making the turn, the right-hand turn, which is fairly steady state. And you notice his peak lateral Gs are only about 1.02. So he might have overslowed a little bit coming into that section. You know, and that's typical. Like that was a fairly challenging section to nail right. So again, a little bit of time perhaps lost there. And I see a message in the chat. I'm just going to check if that's something for me, or was that just a? That's just people saying they don't have audio, etc. All right. Rick, I'm going to rely on you to, when I'm sharing a screen, I don't see the chat on this side. So I have to kind of interrupt my flow to get to it. So if someone asks a question that's relevant, just let me know.
Sure. Real quick on that. So that's Hale. He said lateral G at Coda is super affected by bumps. So that's also, it could be.
Very fair point. Yeah, totally. In this particular section, if you remember, this part was, you know, we're going kind of uphill in this section. And again, there might have been bumps that affected it, but going uphill, I would expect to see a fairly high lateral load capability in the car. And given that, at least in this spot, it's stayed around the 1G area for quite a while, as opposed to, you know, just being a little spike, it indicates that part might have been underdriven a little bit. All right, so let's move forward. We get through that little right-hander, and now we're getting into the tight 180-degree section, right? Now, what's interesting here is, so you see Evan, you know, he brakes really hard. We get this, huge kind of like longitudinal load, so, showing good hard braking. And right at this point, something interesting happens. So this is where he has kind of reached his peak steering angle. You see his lateral load is at roughly at the highest point that he gets during the sweeper. And I don't know if this was intentional or unintentional, but right at this point, he actually gets on the throttle for a little bit. And that actually ends up creating a bit of a problem for him, because right after that, he ends up having to slow down again, right? So perhaps he overslowed for the corner, then tried to add a little bit of speed before having to slow down again. Or maybe he slowed down to the right amount, but then was just a little too early getting back on the gas and ended up having to back out again. So those kinds of things show up here in this data trace, right? And again, around this sweeper, his peak lateral Gs are not as high as they could have been. Again, and you know, the unfortunate thing when looking at just a single run is when you see slightly lower G loads like this, we don't really have a clear way of knowing whether we underdrove the corner or if there was something about the surface that didn't allow us to carry as much speed as we would have liked, right? That shows up a little more easily when you're comparing one run against the other, where if you see the other person having a higher G load, well, then you know that you underdrove it. So, all right, so we talked about him needing to slow down a second time. So let's move through. He exits the corner, and we approach those kind of fast transition sections, right? Now, what I loved about his data here is, so when we're looking at this portion, this is him accelerating hard out of the preceding corner. He backs out of the throttle, you know, just holding steady speed. He hasn't slowed down yet, and he carries really good speed through those transitions. You see kind of big spikes in his lateral Gs, and he's holding good speed through all of it. So this part was really well done by him. And I think it's, yeah, right at this point, this was his peak lateral Gs as he's entering the crossover for the second time. So I think he drove this part really well and got through it well too. So you see a nice clean kind of brake application of the brakes to get into there, and, you know, with a smooth upward tick. This little, whenever you see a sawing pattern like this on acceleration, that typically indicates, you know, some amount of the rear end sliding around and needing to correct, or in this case, it could even be like a little bit of inside rear wheel spin causing the G loads to kind of spike up and down a little bit. But overall, this section was really well done. I think he drove this really well. All right, I want to move the timeline forward until all of this was great. Now, right here is where Evan hits the brakes for the kind of tight right-hander preceding the slalom, right? And so here's where things get a little interesting again. So we see his brake application. He gets a nice nice linear application of the brakes, and also a very smooth brake release. Like this is excellent. His brake release was awesome, and you see that the brake release rate in perfect sync with his lateral load going up to. So this is, you've heard of that kind of visual, right? Of imagine a rope between your pedal and your steering wheel, and as you're trying to turn the steering wheel, you have to release the pedal. So you see that really cleanly here. So that was really well done. Right at this point, so right here, we're at roughly the apex of that corner. And so you see that here too, where this is where he's completed braking. And ideally, this is the point where he would begin accelerating out of the corner. And he tries that. You see his acceleration increase, but he's forced to back out of it, right? Simultaneously, you also see that his lateral G's stay roughly constant over that period, indicating that the angle of the car may have been such that he wasn't quite able to accelerate as hard as he would have liked after it, because he still had a whole bunch of turning left to do. The car hadn't quite rotated as much as he would have maybe liked. Maybe he came into the corner a little bit too fast, or his approach angle may just have been a little bit wrong. So he had to wait to turn a little bit longer before he could start accelerating again. All right, let's keep going. So again, he did really well through the slalom. I can't tell because we don't have the throttle position, but it looks like he might have stayed flat all the way through the slalom, which is awesome. All right, so now we get to the point where it was, what we call it, a 3 or 4 cone slalom, and then that little kind of right-handed angle that you make towards the top half of the course. It appears maybe, again, so we're in this situation where either Evan may have overslowed here in just being cautious and making sure he gets around that right-hander, or the surface didn't allow as much grip, because again, you see his peak G's there, not quite as high as you would like. So there might have been some time lost there. The rest, all of this stuff is really good. He positioned the car well through here. I see good. I think we hit 1.2. It's hard to stop at exactly that point, but I think it was 1.2 Gs going around the left-hander. Again, really well done through the slalom. Now, this is a portion that I really love how he executed. So starting here, this is where he's beginning to slow down for the 180 degree, like the super tight turn. I think some people were calling it the taco turn. So you see again, really good application of the brake. And I love this brake release that is timed perfectly with his turn in to the corner. Just really well executed corner entry, and combined with kind of consistent, taking into account bumps and stuff, but very consistent high lateral load around that entire sweeper. So he did the top half of the course, like all of this section, really well, because good application of the brake, really smooth brake release, transitioning into kind of smooth acceleration. So that part was really well executed by him. So overall, I guess that's most of the run. There's not much else after that. But the things that we noted were some time lost in breaking in for this corner, the kind of acceleration, like needing to double slow down for this one here, the exit out of that corner there. Those are the kind of the biggest areas of lost time. Maybe here as well with not utilizing all of the grip that may have been available. So that's kind of some of the stuff that this data stuff can show us. I guess what would be useful at this point? I can go over another single run, or we can do a comparison, whatever you guys think might be useful.
So John had a comment on the chat about when you're looking at the combined G and backing up a little bit and noticing where it dips for a little bit of time, noticing that the car is definitely underutilized when that's during those extended dips. How realistic is it, or how valuable is it to really just focus on combined Gs and as kind of a first pass of where you can improve? Is that?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. So the combined Gs they dip in two situations, right? So one is you see these kind of like spikes where it dips down. Those are usually just when the car is transitioning from one direction to the other, right? And as you're turning left to right, there's always going to be, no matter how short it is, that's going to be that period in the middle where you have no lateral load. So that's what those spikes are. Where you see areas like this where the combined Gs are fairly low, about 0.5 Gs, that's fairly typical. That's what you're going to see anywhere where a car is at full throttle but not turning, because it just turns out most cars can't accelerate with more than 0.5 Gs in second gear. So that's what you're seeing there. Now that can tell you that you're underutilizing it if you're seeing something that low while there is a reasonable lateral load as well. Then either you're not accelerating as hard as you could be, but in this particular case here, we're seeing kind of minimal lateral load, and all of that 0.5 Gs, or most of it, is coming from the acceleration, and really as much acceleration as the Cayman can provide. But yeah, that's a great question. Actually, because this one, I didn't see an example of this pattern in Evan's data, but a common thing that you see when looking at the combined trace is what's called. I wish I had an example of this to show. Let's see if we can find it somewhere in his run. Well, we'll imagine it for this run. So imagine that this slope had gone higher, and that there was a bit of a dip here, had gone high again before falling off. Like that kind of M pattern is actually fairly common to see in people's data. And what that's telling you is, you see a big rise as people are braking and initiating their turn into the corner. So, they're trail braking or kind of, braking and turning in fairly aggressively. And usually they end up over slowing so that in mid corner, their combined Gs drop because now they've gotten under the limit. So you see this rise as they're trail braking, a drop mid-corner as they're now underutilizing the grip. You see another rise again as they start to unwind the steering a little bit and are starting to accelerate out of the corner. So again, their combined Gs rise before dropping again, and that drop is the natural part. That's just where the steering wheel has gotten straight, so the combined Gs drop to whatever longitudinal Gs your car can accelerate with. So that's a fairly common thing to see, and the takeaway there is that you're just either over slowing on corner entry and then ending up under the limit mid corner, or that you went too deep and caused a problem that way.
Another question. So contextual, right? Do you look for different things based on whether you're doing kind of a full post-event analysis versus when you're doing run-to-run? Are there things that you can quickly look at to kind of make some improvement run-to-run where you don't really have that time to go in depth?
Again, really good question. So obviously, if you're doing it between runs, there's no way you can go through all of this stuff. I'm actually curious to pose this question back to people and see what other people might have to say, because I tend to not look at data between runs. I save all of this stuff for kind of post-event analysis. So I'm curious to hear from other folks in that. How do you use it between runs if you're just looking at your run?
I have a story. I was the first time I used SoloStorm, I was with John Hong and his A Street Z06, and we were at, I think, the Tour, which is one of my first national events, and we were taking a look at the SoloStorm data in between runs, and he was going something crazy like 5 or 10 miles per hour faster through the slalom, and so I just pushed harder and dropped like a ton of time. I remember that very well.
Yeah. So I think that's actually a really good example to talk about, because I think, and maybe I'm wrong, I think if you're going to compare or look at data at an event between runs, it's most useful if you have someone else's run to compare against, because you can see that really quickly, right? You can see difference in speed or kind of where time was lost really quickly. Analyzing a single run, like just your own run with nothing to compare against between runs, is a little harder, just because you have to dive deeper into some of these lateral Gs and longitudinal Gs and try to make sense of it, rather than trying to look at something much simpler like time lost or speed. So that might be something to consider. All right, let's switch to comparing a pair of runs. So here's how you do that. So I'm going to uncheck Evan. Let's compare Matt Leach's 5th run with the Rick's 3rd run. So we'll pick on the Grand Sport drivers this time. And Rick, remind me, those were the two fastest runs, the fastest runs for each of you, right?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. Cool. Hang on, I'm just dismissing an incoming call. All right, so I'm going to switch some of the traces that we're looking at when comparing runs. So the way you do that is you long press on any of the traces you were looking at, and it brings up the entire list. And bear with me if this takes a little bit of time, because for whatever reason, scrolling in this emulator on a Mac seems to behave kind of goofy. So this may take me a minute or two. So if someone has jokes to tell while I'm doing this, go for it, because this literally might take me a minute.
You can also use the mouse to push it up.
I would if I had a mouse. All right, I think I got that right. Okay, so the traces that I find most useful when comparing two runs are the lateral G, but most importantly, the speed trace, the throttle trace, and the time delta. I think those three tell you a lot, and you can get a lot very quickly when comparing two runs. So let's get started with that. Now, something that's pretty key to do is to not start comparing from the initial spot. What you want to do is scroll them forward to roughly where the timing lights were, right? Because that's what you care about. You want to ignore the difference of one person rolling up to the start lights versus the other person maybe launching a little more aggressively from the start to there. So I manually advance it to roughly where I think the start lights were. And if you double click on the map, it aligns the logs at that point in time. So everything should be synced from this point on. All right, so what we're looking at is Matt Leach's the orange trace and Rick is the green trace. So keep that in mind. So at this point, we're going to start moving it forward and see how things go. Come on. All right. So both of them accelerate pretty well. You see their speeds are damn near identical. Rick is in the throttle harder at this point, though it looks like Matt may have started rolling into it just a tiny bit earlier, but the time stays roughly the same. All right, now here's where we start seeing, excuse me, here's where we start seeing a difference in how they slow down for this upcoming corner, right? You see Matt he brakes a lot harder, losing a bunch more speed, whereas Rick's kind of using the brakes much more gradually, carrying a bit more speed into the corner. Come on, advance. But as a result, so at this point, even though Rick is going a whole ton faster, we've reached the point where Matt is now able to get into the throttle quite a bit, while Rick has to wait a fair bit longer to get into the throttle. And that tiny bit of time, even though Rick was at a higher speed, it was for such a short period of time, he didn't really get ahead. And you see that in the time delta too. I mean, it stayed roughly, I ignore these kind of like little bumpy anomalies. It looks like there was no advantage really gained there, or an insignificant advantage. All right, so we move forward. Now here's where Matt's gotten into the throttle a fair bit earlier, and he's able to hold throttle. But again, their speeds can converge at the same level. They both kind of hit the brakes at roughly the same spot to slow down for the 180-degree corner. And now coming out of this corner is where you're going to see a bit of a difference between the two. Now here too, you see Rick do maybe a similar thing to what we saw Evan do. Like there's a little bit of a throttle spike mid-corner, maybe because he overslowed just a tiny bit coming into the corner and kind of adjusted his speed back up to get to the limit. That seems to be the case because you see that here in his lateral load too. You see he entered the corner with a good lateral load, but then fell below the limit just a little bit, having overslowed. Quickly got back on the throttle to get back to the limit. So that was good recognition on his part to not, and kind of remain under the limit for too long. But in doing that, his throttle application out of the corner was delayed and less smooth, right? You see Matt's got this nice slope where he's able to get to full throttle, where Rick's had to kind of, he gets in a little bit, backs out just a tiny bit more before kind of hammering full throttle again. So you see Matt's speed trace just inching ahead, and you see kind of on the map too, his kind of position markers inching forward as well. I'm going to pause here because I just see the little blinking too, saying there's some. I don't know if there's a questions that people have in the chat, or was there some just some.
Oops, sorry about that. Says, does SoloStorm offer data versus distance?
It does, but again, given there's a distance trace as well, I haven't found it to be really accurate, so I haven't relied on it. But maybe that's just me not using it right. So if others are able to find value of it, that's great. It is an available trace. Like if you long press in here, somewhere in this list is kind of distance traveled. So it shows you the cumulative distance. As you're scrolling, then you're getting the distance kind of over time.
Yeah, and he also mentioned that doing it that way, you can compare the data without needing to keep realigning it. And that's a question I had too. Going through and comparing two runs, what is kind of the best practice for when to realign, right? Because you can quickly become out of sync, especially if you have a much faster driver and a little bit slower driver. So when do you resync? So
there are a couple of different. It's hard to give one kind of fail-safe rule because it depends on how and where the time deltas are occurring. It all depends on what you're trying to find. So let's contrive a scenario. Let's say that let's say Rick, on one particular corner, you entered that corner faster and looks like you picked up time on that corner entry, right? So to see just the effect of your corner entry and how that kind of what effect that might have had, I might sync up the two runs immediately prior to that. Like anywhere where I see things where you and the other driver are equal, I'd try to sync it to that point to then see the difference from that point forward, and kind of do that element by element to see how exactly you gain time in a particular element. Essentially trying to discount what may have happened before, right?
Makes sense.
Another thing to keep in mind is if you're trying to evaluate corner entry, you want to try to eliminate the speed with which you may have come out of the previous element. One driver may have gotten a much better exit out of the previous element before coming into this one. So I would sync up the two, maybe at the point after both drivers have gotten on the brakes. That way you ignore everything that happened prior about one driver having a better corner exit.
Okay.
So that's when you're just comparing elements. The other is, again, if one driver is just a lot faster than the other, you'd resync anywhere. I'd say when the delta gets more than 3 or 4 tenths, everything starts getting out of sync, where like the throttle application and all the traces are so far out of sync that it's not meaningful to compare them again. So I'd sync them back in some neutral territory around there. Like when both people are on a straight, or at the apex of a corner, just anywhere where there's not a transition occurring.
Sure. So there are a couple of the comments. We'll catch up a little bit. One of them, Evan says, you can also long press where the time is, and it'll change to feet, I guess, down at the bottom. And then Todd mentioned that if you're using sectors, it also can be useful as well.
Yeah, for sure.
And then GPS, getting a good GPS signal possibly leaving GPS on for a little bit of time before you start logging seems to make it more accurate.
That's true. So the Q stars and like, I think all GPS receivers, they're just trying to lock onto as many GPS satellites as they can. So, I mean, not that it's a rule, but like for myself, I mean, I tend to just kind of stick my GPS on the car, before first heat's about to start or something like that. And even if I'm running second heat, I just leave it running the entire day essentially, because the battery in that thing will last like a good 10 hours or more. So basically, earlier I can get it set up. I just kind of tend to do that and get it out of the way. So I make sure I have a good signal.
Yep.
All right. So moving forward with this, so here's where we see Matt start to pull out a little bit, partly because of that corner exit that he got previously, but then he gets a big kind of jump ahead here, where through those gaps or the offsets transitions kind of before going through the crossover the second time, he's more aggressive there, carrying more speed through that, just being a little less cautious. So you see the delta start to grow. And what's typical is, when you see someone carry more speed through a section, the time delta doesn't grow, it grows starting that point and moving forward, right? So the effect is maybe a little delayed in showing up on the time delta. But as I move this forward, you see, I mean, at this point, we're looking about over 0.3 of a difference that Matt has pulled out, essentially from the apex of the 180 through to here. So that was really well driven. So at this point, I mean, I feel like the delta has gotten enough to where I want to resync it, because you start seeing, I can't make sense of who did what better at this point because the maps have just gotten completely out of sync. So I'd sync them back there. And both of them, it looks like Matt slowed down a little earlier than Rick for the I guess the 90-ish or 120-degree corner. You see that both in the trace, and I don't know if it's showing up on y'all's screens, but yeah, Rick looks slightly ahead on the crosshairs as well. But again, the result of it is that Matt's able to get on the throttle earlier. Rick's is delayed by some amount of time. Even though Rick's able to get to 100% throttle, then it's just that entry forces him to wait before he's able to begin his throttle application. They both get through the slalom. So now it looks like right around this point is where Matt again carries a slightly higher speed through the middle of the slalom. And here's where there's a rather large delta in how they both executed the right-hander after the slalom. And this is where Rick even, I think he mentioned to me at the event, he was being a little overcautious in that corner. And then on his last run, his fifth run, I think he went the opposite end and DNF'd that corner, trying to carry too much speed there. But here, this is something where it's really easy to see the difference, right? Where Matt just carried so much more speed than Rick. And you see that time delta just jump in that this is basically a half second picked up in one corner. So that was a huge amount of time lost in a very tiny space. Through the next left-hander as well. So we're starting to see a pattern forming here, right? In that even though Rick's staying at full throttle longer, it's maybe costing him, because you see consistently Matt slowing down earlier, getting into elements, and he's then able to get on the throttle earlier coming out of it and has a more progressive lean into it. As a result, like because he slows down earlier, he's generally able to even carry more speed mid-corner than Rick is able to. So you see that happen again on this right-hander where where Matt it looks like he positions himself better for the sweeper. He's able to carry more speed around it and then able to accelerate better coming out of it. Again, picks up, looks like 0.3 coming out of that corner and then getting through the slalom. So we'll sync it back there again to where, their speeds are at sync, so that we now want to we want to ignore everything that came prior. So I'm trying to ignore everything from the slalom, and I'm just evaluating how they both kind of got on the brakes coming into the sweeper and then got out of it. So both of them hard on the brakes here. You see obviously both of them have zero throttle. They're hard on the brakes, both slowing down. Da-da-da-da-da. Now, throttle application here, it looks like Rick gets in a little harder, is forced to back out. You know, he kind of has a couple of kind of in and outs with the throttle. Rick, I mean, I can't guess what you may have been doing there. It might have been, again, it looks here like you were under the limit at some portion of it, so you may have been adding some speed just to get closer to the limit. Hard to say exactly what, but I see Matt have a, you know, apart from this little dip here, a little bit smoother ramp up on corner exit as well. Come on, keep moving. But it looks like Rick actually pulls it. Looks like Rick got a cleaner exit out of the sweeper, but this is what's telling here is it looks like Matt, in that little vertical gap that we had before the finish, Matt stayed braver and kind of stayed in the throttle harder through that, and then picked up speed on you through to the end. So anyway, kind of rushed through that to make sure we kind of get through, you know, in an hour. It's almost 9 o'clock, and I wanted to make sure I leave some time for people to ask questions. But I mean, generally, when comparing runs, two runs, this is a much faster analysis to do than trying to look at a single run, because here you have very tangible things to compare from one person to the next. You're seeing their throttle application, you're seeing the speed that they carried through elements, and you're seeing visually the time delta or the effect of those of carrying speed, right? So it becomes much quicker to look at this stuff. Let's pause here and see what folks think or have to say, or I'm sure other people use SoloStorm differently too. So if there's other insights that other people want to share of how they use it, that'd be great too. Or not.
I was going to ask why you typically, or why you're not using any sections.
How do I best answer that? I guess I don't use, I haven't gotten into a habit of using sections because I find that by just kind of realigning the logs on the fly, I'm able to kind of create my segments on the fly while analyzing it as and when I need. So I don't rely on kind of predetermined segments. But again, I might be missing out, right? Like there might be something really cool that you can do with segments that I just haven't gotten around to taking full advantage of.
So, and Chris is asking on the chat, the green bars on the time delta section, what do those mean? I think those are large deltas.
So I assume you're talking about this section down here, right? So the orange one always stays flat, but that's just, it takes one of the drivers and kind of uses them as a baseline. And the other, the green trace in this case, is showing time below, or I guess faster or slower than than the orange trace, right? So anytime the green trace is below, it means it took less time. It was that driver was faster at that point. So let's kind of go back here to the start.
And then the vertical bars, right? They show kind of areas to look at where a significant time was gained or lost. Right?
Yeah,
That's configurable.
Yep. So like right here, where you see the green line go above, that's, you know, it's showing you that Rick fell behind, right? His time was 0.2 behind Matt's time. And yeah, as Rick just mentioned, the green bars are showing you that that's where an event occurred, right? Like that's essentially where the slope of the line changed significantly. What else?
Is there anybody else that has data up there that wants to take a look at anything while we're on the line? I think it was pretty comprehensive for those two runs, but you know, there's a lot of data out there.
Let's see. I mean, from the ones that I downloaded, we can look at like Strelnick's run and mine. If you want to see how an NSX makes a Corvette look like a really slow car. So So again, for Strelnick's, I don't have his throttle percentage. His throttle inputs don't come in. So I'm going to switch that out. Instead of throttle position, let's get come back. Let's get longitudinal acceleration. All right, so we'll align it again back to roughly where the start lights were. So we go through here.
One other comment, Vivek.
Yeah.
You typically don't zoom in, I'm noticing. I tend to zoom in on the track. It just seems to show the details when you really start to make an advance.
Yeah.
Kind of guessing on when the crosshairs are starting to separate.
It's true. It's Tom. I do that when I'm on a device. That's just really hard to do on the emulator with just a trackpad.
That's kind of what I was wondering.
Yeah, that's just a nuance of doing it on the computer. But yeah, so looking at here, so it looks like Strelnick's accelerated much harder in just that opening section. Gets to a much higher speed. He's like 6 miles an hour faster than me through there. But it looks like he might have gotten on the brakes a little too much, where I carried a little more entry speed and got back most of the delta on him there. But once again, on corner exit, on those short bursts, he's able to pick up speed really quickly. You see him accelerate really hard. That's most evident coming out of this 180, where if I sync us up here, his car just picks up speed so fast. We're talking about like an 8-9 mile an hour difference coming out of those sweepers. But again, he seems to kind of slow down a little bit early going into stuff, and it just blasts out of him with all the acceleration, which is not a bad strategy when you have that much power in your car.
I think this is interesting too, though, because even with two completely different cars,
yeah,
you can still see some of the kind of driver technique in the G traces, right? Where you guys are doing very similar things and driving very similar techniques, just because of the proficiency on both, independent of the cars, right? So
yeah, totally, for sure. That actually shows up a bit. I think like starting from here, like we sync it up here. You see, excuse me. I think I'm not confident that when you get logs from two different devices, their accelerometer calibrations are likely going to be slightly different. So these aren't going to be exact. I bet these traces through this section, I imagine, would look very similar for both of us coming out of here. Kind of the pattern's at least the same, right? Where we both have this hard brake and a kind of smooth release of trail braking with kind of getting into the throttle. So you see a very similar pattern in how we're driving there. And this is where he picked up a ton of time again. So I'd synced up the runs here, and just coming out of that corner, accelerating into the slalom, he's able to pick up so much more speed. Again, like 7 miles an hour in just that short little run. But it's hard to tell where through the slalom where I'm able to carry more speed than him, whether that was a driver error on his part or, there are vehicle differences, right? The NSX is wider than the Corvette and such. So it's hard to say how exactly that delta occurred. But it kind of made up that gap on him there. And this is the section that where I think I was lucky enough to kind of do fairly well through here in that. So we're both fairly even through the slalom, but now on sweeper entry, you'll start to see me pulling ahead, where I carried a lot more speed coming into the slalom. Into the sweeper, and held a good line and was able to get on the throttle. And where you would think, despite the NSX acceleration advantage, I managed to stay ahead of him just by getting on the throttle earlier and harder than him. And I wish we had the throttle trace for both of us to kind of see that. But that part worked out fairly well. Where we were in sync here from there to the finish. I actually picked up 4/10 on Eric at that point. It's just from the start to here, he had picked up about 7/10 on me. So that's the delta. But anyway, I'll shut up about these runs. I want to hear from other people because I've been going on a monologue for a little while.
Matt in the chat said, would be interesting to see how different card types in the same class compare to each other.
Yeah. I wish we had Eric Jones's runs up here, or some of the other B Street cars or something like that, because that's always interesting to see. I think we looked at that a little bit from the Texas tour, when we had those runs. But yeah, it'd be good to see that from this event.
Yeah, and particularly PAX classes, he was saying, right? How much delta is there?
Yep.
All right. Any other questions? Don't want to keep everybody too late. All right.
Are we planning to do this in the future?
We can. I mean, if there's demand for it, if there's interest in it, yeah. I mean, I'm down for it. I think this would again be particularly useful as we get more people uploading their runs, so that we're not looking at the same people's runs over and over again. So not that I get any commission from trying to get more people to buy SoloStorm or anything, but just the more people's runs that we get, I think then it's more interesting to folks, right? So that we're not just seeing the same stuff all the time.
Yeah, I agree, and I think even once we get through it, a couple of times, if we continue to do it, I think it'd be even without Vivek leading, I think some of us could kind of take over too, and kind of take some of the weight off as we learn how to do it, right? Because this could be more of a community thing. I think it's cool, especially tied to an event, right? Because we just ran yesterday. It's fresh in everybody's mind. Kind of as we talk about it and compare logs and compare runs, we all have a pretty good idea of what the course looked like, and I think it's fun. I'd like to do it more. So definitely interested in your feedback. Not necessarily, don't have to all speak up now, but send us feedback, and we'll try to do it again soon.
I was going to say it might be a good idea to, we can just bring a few tablets to some of the meetings. I mean, if we don't want to have a call after each event, we always have the meeting, so it'd be a good opportunity. If everybody uploads their stuff early, we can all kind of pull it down and take it and look at it face to face over a beer.
Yeah.
Yep, it's not a bad idea. All right. Well, I think that's probably all we have. Thank you, Vivek, for walking us through that. Really appreciate it. As you mentioned, if you haven't looked at Beyond Seat Time, definitely go take a look at the website. And I like the paid course as well. So check that out if you're so inclined.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. All right. We're going to shut it down. Appreciate everybody's time, and hopefully talk to some of you at the actual in-person meeting tomorrow. Thanks.
All right. Bye.